For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jim. I run Nature's Work, which is an organisation really just spreading learning about the natural world. This talk is split into two sections. We're looking at lichens first and then mosses. And I like to have interactive nature of my workshop. So, there's some interactive Kahoots, one at the in between and then one there at the end. So if you've got a mobile phone or a tablet and you like to take part, then there'll be an opportunity to take part in a short little fun quiz, or you can just sit back and enjoy it. So I'll just start with my presentation, mosses and lichens. Don't worry if it goes too quickly and it's a bit too speedy. I will share the presentation with those who would like it afterwards. Okay, so but we're entering this world of miniature. It's a fantastic world. Very, very diverse group of plants. We're going to look at the ecology of both lichens and mosses. We'll describe their key features and help identify them when we're out in the field. And that's really the main point, is how do we learn how to recognize certain organisms when we're out walking or differentiating between them. And hopefully to make ecology and looking at the natural world more accessible, and encourage you to take a closer look at the natural world around us. And as you can see here, this is a small lichen, and the photos that I take are generally with a macro lens, just to illustrate the characteristics of them, but they're absolutely minuscule little things. And this guy's got a hand lens. So yes, there we go. So what are lichens? I mean, if you ever been scuba diving, then looking at the world of lichens is like your first time scuba diving. It's a really wonderful, colourful, diverse world, such exotic life forms and structures and reproductive strategies. But a lichen essentially made up of two components: a fungus, like this toadstool, and an algae. Now, the organism that's a result of these two looks nothing like either of the partner. Not just any fungus will form a lichen. So we've got the toadstool here, which, if you ever looked underneath a mushroom, button mushroom, when you're cooking, you get the gills. So they generally don't make lichens. So the fungi with the gills generally don't make lichens, but the ones which are called sac fungi, these ones do produce lichens. And about 20% of all fungi in the world can produce lichen. So it's a significant form for them. And they're both thought to benefit from the association. The algae, being photosynthetic, release nutrients and sugars, and the fungi offer protection to the harsh environment and protection from drought and high temperatures. Fungi as well are thought to release minerals from the substrate. So underneath, it's supposed to break down the substrate and release minerals for the organism to survive. I mentioned a word up here, cyanobacteria. So we've got a fungus and we've got an algae, but sometimes you've got this thing called a cyanobacteria, which is a type of blue-green algae. And there's about 10% of all lichens are formed with this blue-green algae. But you can see the structures that we've got here, and we're going to run through all these later. And here we've got 3 different types. And then we've got ones in that image, a big mosaic of lichen there, and we'll run through those. So the organism, we call it a plant. It's not a strict plant, but it's like an honorary plant. And that organism, that's a result of these two components, is able to survive in a habitat that on their own they wouldn't be able to survive. So neither the algae or the fungi could survive, but together they combine to produce this organism, which looks nothing like either, but also has this ability to survive in these really extreme places. They cover about 8% of the entire world surface and about 8.5% of all plant life. So they're really quite significant, very, very diverse. They are found all across the continents, from Antarctica, tolerating the bitterly cold conditions, through to the droughts of the driest deserts in the world, from the highest mountains to the tropics, and even into coastal waters, from the highest, from the highest mountains. And there's roughly 18,500 species in the world, 1,700 of which are in the UK, which is about 10%, which is a vastly significant amount. And it's down to the climate that we've got, which is very suitable to having lichens here, lichen growth. They're also one of the oldest growth forms, life forms on the planet, and they were the first to colonize land about 400 million years ago. So they're very ancient. These associations are very ancient. Many lichens are conspicuous and can be easily noticed. Others are minuscule and coat rocks and trees and require a kind of a skilled eye or a microscope to identify them. But the growth forms are so diverse. We've got some images there. We're going to go through and describe them in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So we have 5 major growth forms, or we're just going to group them into growth forms. First one is crustose lichen. So these are like they've been painted onto the surface of the rock. You can't peel them up without damaging them. You can't remove them. They're attached and they're like they've just been painted onto the surface, and they're flat. They don't have any roots as such, but they do attach with special cells, fungal cells that hold on to the rock. So they hang on, but they don't really go and penetrate through. Because they don't have any roots, they can't absorb water through their root system. So they get the water from humidity in the air and rainfall. If the lichens grew on their own, they'd be circular in form, but you can see that like mosaic there, beautiful, colourful habit on the rock there, because there's the competition has created this environment, but they would be circular if it wasn't for that. So the next form is foliose lichen. These are probably the most conspicuous ones, the ones that you're more likely to have come across and noticed, hanging off trees or on rocks and things. And they have an upper surface and often a different coloured undersurface. And you can peel them off the surface, the substrate, without damaging them. They can grow quite large, and they're also probably the most complex in their structure from any of the lichen forms. You can see in this little inset image, we've got these tiny root-like structures. So they're used for attaching to the substrate. So they're the leafy lichens. Then we get what's called the fruticose lichens, the beard lichens, or the bushy lichens. And they have pads of fungal tissues that attach onto the substrate, and then they have a branch and stem kind of structure, and can be hanging down quite long. And if you've been in tropics somewhere in humid forests and things, you'll see these beautiful draping shapes and forms of those. Then we get one which is often indistinguishable because it's called leprose. It's powdery, and it doesn't look like it's organized in any way at all. It can be missed. It doesn't really resemble an organism. It just looks like powdery mildew or something. They lack a real structure, and they're like granular. So they're like the algae and the fungi cells all growing together, but it's in this granular form. And they haven't got this structure. Like this has got the top structure, this has got a top layer, and this one's even got a bottom layer, and this one's wrapped around. So it doesn't have any form like that. And then the 5th form, which we can look at, are the ones which are producing scales, or squamulose. Apologies for the big technical words in lichens and ecology. There seems to be a lot of words, but there's also some familiar common names that we can give them, more descriptive, like overlapping scales. So these are very similar to the foliose lichen, the leafy lichens, but they've got these flattish plates, and the structure of those separate them from foliose lichens. But they are growth forms, they're not species. So we can just cluster the organisms that we see into those growth patterns. So as I mentioned, the structure, you've got an image here. We've got various lichens here. Just as an idea, what percentage of that rock do you think is covered by lichen there? You don't need to answer, I'll just have a thought. I mean, we've got this obvious one here when we look closely, and this one there, and the orange one. And there's a brown one here. So the entire surface of that is covered by lichen. Across those lichen have this top layer. I'm trying to keep the language as simple as possible tonight. We have a top layer, and then we have these filaments, and they attach onto the bottom. And then the algae form a layer within. These cells form, so the majority of what you see in a lichen is the fungal part of that symbiosis. And then a foliose lichen has an upper layer. It has the threads in the middle, and then a lower layer, and then you have these attaching points that go down and attach to the substrate. So that's why you can peel those up. So that's, for those interested, we can look at the cross section of a lichen. In terms of reproduction, the reproductive part is the fungi, and they reproduce through spores. It's a sexual reproduction method, and they produce it from these structures. So as you've been walking, you may have noticed when you sit by a rock or you look on a tree, and you can see these features, but these marks on them. So they're the reproductive bodies, and they've got a name. They're grouped together. All these little spores are produced here in this big structure, which is known as an apothecum. I'm not sure how you pronounce these words. So they're quite conspicuous. They can be circular, they can be slit shaped, or they could be, sometimes you find in the moorlands, you get these familiar trumpet shaped ones, or like a cup or goblet. There's some discs that actually stick out extended from the surface. And then you get these discs as well, or you might get them that look like that. So some of these are fairly known to us, but when the spores are ripe, they're released into the air, they're carried by the wind, and if they settle in a suitable place, then they'll germinate, but they need to meet the algae to germinate and form the lichen. So it's luck. So where the algae are living, if it lands on the algae, it can form a lichen. There are some that are parasitic, and they will fall onto a lichen that's already formed, and then they'll steal the algae from that lichen and take over. So you get some parasitic organ types as well. Lots of organisms produce sexually, as we've seen, but then also by asexual methods. So there are some lichens that will only reproduce. They don't produce those cup-shaped spore or organs. They just produce by asexual means. And by this, we're making little fragments. So we're just breaking parts of the plant off. Propagation and the propagules, for instance, when you take a cutting in horticulture, you propagate, you take a bit of the plant or the stem or the root, and you make a new plant from that. So plants do that naturally. Lichens also do that. They contain both algae and fungi cells, and they just break off. And there are two different things that you may be able to see when you're looking in the future. There's a structure which looks like a powdery granule, or like a rupture, and then there's something that looks like a pin-like growth, which you get as well. So you get the two forms. So that's like a rupture, sporidia, and then isidia. They're like a pin-like growth, and they've got like a cortex, a layer around them. So we have a few ideas here, a few examples, sorry. You might be able to see this pin-like structure here, and there's pin-like structures there. So which ones are which? So just give you a second to look at those. So some are pin-like and some are powdery. So the pin-like ones are those three, and then the powdery ones are those. So they're on the leaf margins or on the surface of the leaf itself. A lot of names are quite difficult to get a head around, and you know, some species have common names, which is really helpful when we see them, but there's so much diversity, it's very difficult to spot them or to accurately identify lichens. But there are some that are quite familiar if we walk in the mountains. So this one you might recognize as reindeer moss. So some of these have got nice names that we're familiar with, and they're the more common ones, I suppose we'd say, but they've also got a specific species. That one very common in the mountains, exposed, map lichen. An image we saw a little bit earlier with the matchstick head there, the devil's matchsticks. This one may not be so familiar, but it's widespread and you'll probably notice it from now on. It's called trottle. This one looks a bit warty in the woodland and it's known as bitter wart lichen. And then this one looks a bit like blisters and pustules, and its Latin name is pustulata. So it gives it a kind of context for that, the shape of these structures there, or rock tripe. So lichens can survive in very exposed conditions. Neither the parent or the component part organism can survive the conditions that the lichen in its form can survive. So they're extreme, they're very tough and resilient. They can live for long periods of drought and high temperatures. And they can also lie dormant for very long periods of time, which is of benefit to them in a long life. Okay, so this video is a very short video, and we'll just have a look at a lichen that you might see on a dry day and you think, oh, it's dead, but actually you look at it a little bit closer and it will just come to life. So this is a time lapse. This is a very common lichen that you find through the coast, right through the cities and in the woodlands. So that just gives an idea of how organisms, how they can change. On a dry day, they may look dead, but actually give them a little throw of water and they'll come to life. So that ability to lose water and gain water is really beneficial to lichen. So they can lie dormant for long periods of time. They can, when they're active, they're more susceptible to being damaged. So when it's dry, they can tolerate the long dry periods and they're less likely to get damaged, and they're less likely to get grazed as well. So they function metabolically when it's wet, but not when they're dry. So this ability allows them, well, means they grow relatively slowly, but also they can live for quite a long time. They can survive these extreme climates as well. So the lichens can survive the temperature minus 196 degrees centigrade, where liquid nitrogen occurs, and they've been known to survive at that low temperature and also above 100 degrees centigrade. But their range is generally between minus 20 and plus 70. I mentioned about them getting damaged. So when they're dry, they're less likely to get damaged and broken and grazed as well. So that helps their survival. I mean, the diversity of them in Britain, we've got 10% of the world's lichen, is testament to the environments that we've got here, the oceanic, cool oceanic climate. It's perfect for lichen growth, huge range of habitats as well. I mentioned that their growth rates can be very slow. So you can see these layers and these lines as this crustose lichen is expanding. And they expand at a rate of about 0.5 to 1 millimeter per year. Whereas these lichens, like the fruticose lichen here, will grow maybe 2 centimeters or so a year potentially. So much faster growing and much slower growing. And that slow growth is a pattern for a long life. So a cross-dose lichen is known to be old at 100 years old, whereas one of these foliose lichens is likely to be old at 10 years old. Okay, so the kind of longevity of the cross-dose lichens is greater. They can accurately date the exposure of a rock surface up to 500 years. So that's been tested and accurately known by scientists who've carbon dated rocks, and they've got the growth patterns. So accuracy up to 500 years. So that shows how long lived they are. And some of them are even able to date back to when the Ice Age occurred. So we've got some extremely old ancient life forms. Lichens have plenty of substances within them. Lots and lots of different compounds, which makes them so colourful. And there's 200 odd substances and compounds being identified from different acids, salicylic acid like aspirin, plant-based foods that you find in fruit skins, flavonoids. You get coloured pigments. There's all sorts of things that occur within these. But most of them only occur when they're in the lichen form. So the fungi wouldn't produce them, nor would the algae. But when they're together, they produce this amazing concoction of all these different compounds. And they have many functions. So some will screen sunscreen and give protection from UV. Others chemically weather the rock surface that they're on. Others give a bitter taste, so they're good for anti-grazing. A bit like penicillin, you've got some of the fungal components which are antibiotic, and there's a lot of research that's been going on with some lichen species for their antibiotic properties. Lichens are also used for dyeing clothes. So the Harris tweed industry uses crottle, xanthora. You get lovely coloured, I'll show in a second, lovely coloured pigments that come out of these. So they've been historically used for a very, very long time. Antibiotics I've mentioned, but the oak moss, which is fairly common in maritime oceanic woodlands in the UK, is used in perfumes, and the French use or harvest 700 tons of oak moss per year for their perfume industry. So it shows how significant it is for that perfume as well. So these compounds. In terms of the chemistry in these substances, we can look at doing some tests. And with all these different substances, you can produce a variety of colours with certain chemicals. So you can place a small drop of a reagent or a chemical, a known chemical, onto a lichen and have a look at the reaction. You might need to get close to see the reaction as they convey quickly. So a hand lens is useful. This image is, some people looking at moss is not lichen, so you'd never be bringing the lichen up to you like that, especially with the chemicals. But this was a spot test I did with a group last autumn, and you can see how the colour changed from yellow to red, whereas this didn't change colour at all. So the reaction of the compound was to change this chemical to that. Chemicals are used to bleach, caustic soda, both very toxic. You've got iodine, you've got a weak acid like lemon juice. So a certain chemical would give a certain response to a certain lichen. So you need to know what you're looking for and what the reaction would illustrate. So I'd take a little dab, look at the reaction, and then wash it off soon afterwards to dilute it and do less damage. Some lichens also fluoresce. So if you have a UV light, a torch, you can buy them quite cheaply, and you're on a night nav or you're out walking in the evening, you could see if there's any fluorescent lichen as you're going for a walk. Lichens are also what we know as bioindicators. So they tell us what, especially air quality is like. They're very sensitive organisms, and it's due mainly to their really effective absorption system that they've got. So they're useful for indicating how much sulfur dioxide there is in the air, which is produced by burning fossil fuels. And with water vapor, the sulfur dioxide produces an acid in the air, and that falls, and it can decimate the lichen organisms in an area. All but the most tolerant species will disappear. So you can use them as pollution tolerant and pollution indicators, or clean air indicators. And ammonia, again, from agriculture and intensive animal husbandry, it dissolves in rainwater, and much the same way as sulfur dioxide, you can have a look at the effect. And nitrogen as well. So certain species are known to be tolerant, and some are known to be sensitive. There are lots of fold-out charts. A lot of these are available online. You can download them, and then you can start looking around and just reading the description, seeing what you've got, your clean air. I've used these for years with citizen science projects as well. One interesting story is with this peppered moth. It takes back to a story that I learned when I was at school. And one of the things I remember from my biology was when the teacher was telling us about the peppered moth. They occur in this white form with black speckles. And as you see there, fantastically camouflaged against a lichen-rich bark of a tree. But there's also another form that exists, a black form, a genetic variety. And you can see the white form is really clearly camouflaged there, and the black form isn't, so it would be more easily predated in clean air where there's lots of lichen coverage. But in the cities, and this was known from the Industrial Revolution really, lots of cities had black soot, and a lot of the lichens were killed from the trees, and the black forms were really prevalent, and the white forms were more easily predated. So you had this transition from heavy polluted areas to clean areas, so the peppered moth is a good indicator of that, but sadly they're in decline. Just run through a few of the habitats that we'll see lichens in, and then we'll go for our Kahoot. So in our mountains we get many lichens, lots of crustose lichens especially, but they're related primarily to the rock type. So the top image here, you can see all the silica in the silica-rich rock there. So that's what we call an acidic rock. And there's the map lichen, very, very prominent on that, but not so many other lichens that are easily identifiable there. This image below is a base-rich area. So it's got more minerals and more basic compounds. There's more, maybe it's more easily eroded and broken, dissolved by the lichen. But you get these white lichens there. You don't get them on the top. So you've got the acidic and then the base rich, and the rocks are different colors, but the coverage is very different. So they're very specific. So if you look really closely in boulder fields and scree, you'll see a whole host of different types of lichen. This one looks like a coral lichen, and so on. So huge display. Then we've got across the moorland, so the lower levels where there's going to be more competition from mosses. There's some fantastic life forms that you'll see, from crustose lichens to the beautiful fast growing. If you think about a moorland, you've got environment which is grazed, it's cut, it's mowed, burnt. So plants have to grow back quite quickly. So some of you may recognize some of those. So the reindeer moss, for instance, is living there amongst young bilberry, maybe 2 or 3 years before it had been burned. So that's grown back there. The dog lichen is growing in a wet area, wet moorland. This cottle's on a rock environment. And again, you've got competition with mosses. So being fast growing from the cladonia species there, or if you're on a rock, you can be extravagant like this. Beautiful example of, looks like a volcanic explosion, really, that lichen there. In woodlands, got classic humid environments. You've got some very, fantastic range of habitats, more humid, especially in and around gorges. And there are some wonderful names of some of these lichens. So witch's whiskers, this is probably one of the rarer species. You only find it really in the west, where it's clean air, low sulfur, very sensitive to nitrogen. bloody heart lichen. I quite like the name of that. I saw that the other day, and it's got these lovely red sanguine, as the name suggests. This one on birch trees, and then black-eyed Susan. I've never seen that before. Last week, actually, I've never seen it with the black eye. These are spore capsules, and then another Cladonia species there. So the phenomenal diversity in our woodlands. Then on the coast, we've got, you can see here, high up, you've got this lovely green lichen, then below it, more orangey lichen. You come down, it's black. And it's really incredible, that zonation, as you go to the very salty environment, as you come up where it's more spray and still very salt-tolerant species. So you get things like sea ivory, and then you get the orange sea lichen. And then there's this crab eye lichen, which you may have seen a few coast-steering, prominent reproductive structures there. And then the layer that looks like it's been tar is actually a lichen, black tar lichen. And then even down with the barnacles and some of the seaweeds, you get black tuft lichen. So that was a whistle-stop look at the world of lichens. Now, if you've got a second device here and you like to take part in a Kahoot, then the code is going to come up shortly for this. I'm going to play this. If you were to type in kahoot.it on a web browser, we're going to play a classic game. So here's the website, so kahoot.it. And if you enter the pin 8646208, enter your name. If you don't want to play, that's absolutely fine. You can sit back and watch. There we go, Will. Fantastic. There will be another chance of one of these in a little while as well. So I'm sure more people, if you can't join, I think you can join halfway through this. So. True or false? Lichens are used in litmus paper to test if a substance is acidic or alkaline. And it is true. There's a specific lichen which is used as an indicator there. Well done, Thomas. Slipped in that answer early on, so you may have remembered. And it is 8%. It's phenomenal considering 70% of the world is ocean. So they cover everywhere. Like in the lich, I like that name. True or false? In Greenland, a lichen has been aged at 8,600 years. And that's a picture of a lichen which lives a very long time in our mountains. It's map lichen. And it's true. It's a map lichen, which we get in Britain, 8,600 years old. So lichens, slow growers, but some are quite fast. Bit of a guess, really. So the fastest foliage lichens grow 2 to 3 centimeters per year. Great, a lot of you guessed that one correctly. Well done, Claire. And the final question. In ancient Egypt, lichens were used to fill the body cavities of mummies. Yes, that is true as well. So yeah, well done, everyone. And we'll have a quick look at the leaderboard. That's great, 5 out of 5. Well done, Rich. Ed, well done. And the winner, Lichen the Lich. Had to be. Thank you, whoever that is. That's great. There we go. Fantastic. We're going to move into the world of mosses. I'm just aware that the time's slipping there. So the world of mosses, again, these miniature life forms, very ancient life forms that have been on our planet for 350 million years. They're very ancient. We look at mosses, but mosses actually belong to a bigger group called the bryophytes, and they include things called liverworts, which we're going to have a look at both mosses and liverworts. But just looking at things that are small and green living in the bottom of a forest floor, you're going to say, oh, it's a moss, but actually there are slightly differences. But you know, that's a technicality. But they're all called the bryophytes. And you can see the capsules here. They're spore-bearing organisms, and they date back 350 million years. So not quite as old as the lichen, but still very ancient life forms. And they've evolved before there was a transport system. So like lichens, they can't transport water. Lichens don't have the ability to transport water from the roots up to the leaves. So their roots, they're not true roots as such. All they do is hold on to whatever substrate that they're on, be it bark or a rock or in soil on your roof. So they have an ability to hang on and anchor themselves down rather than transport. So they need to generally live in dry areas, damp areas, and if they dry out, then the humid environments are much more suitable. So damp woodlands, for instance. A quick video, 20-second video, just to illustrate what happens when you soak one of these mosses. Every cell has the ability to take up water, so they don't transport water, but every cell can take up water, but every cell can also lose water as well. So they have to withstand periods of drought, and those little hair-like structures you saw on those leaves there do help apparently with desiccation or tolerance from drying out. So they're known as the lower plants or the primitive plants, but really they're just very early. They evolved way before oak trees and bluebells arrived on the planet. And there's even some, I think in Antarctica there was a survey where a core was taken earlier in this century, it's about 2014, and some researchers found, they took an ice core and they saw mosses that had been buried or frozen for 1,500 years, and they brought them back, slowly melted the ice and then brought them back, and within a couple of weeks they started to grow cells and divide again. So even something that's been dormant for 1,500 years has been shown to come back to life and carry on living. So they can tolerate some incredible extreme conditions. Just over 1,000 species in Britain, 25,000 species worldwide. So if we look at the mosses first, and then we'll look at liverworts afterwards. So mosses are much more numerous than the liverworts. They have a stem, they have leaves, and they have this prominent midrib, which you can see there. They have these anchorage organs, or structures, which just hold in. They're called rhizoids. And a moss is either branched or unbranched. And then I mentioned that they get these hairy tips as well. So they're generally very small because they don't have this support structure like a tree has got. So they're generally very small. So they're just a few millimeters tall maybe, or some of the tall ones like this star moss can grow up to 40 centimeters tall. They may form tufts, they may form big cushions, or they may carpet and form mats in forest floors and on the side of trees. Liverworts generally lack that structure. So they have these lobes. They don't really all have this midrib and leaf structure, but they have this body known as a thallus, or they can be leafy. So they can have either one of those two forms. So we've got a few examples here. So this one is known as a snake moss, and that is a leafy lichen. And the other three are technically, they're all liverworts, but they're thallus liverworts. So these are just additional cells rather than midribs. In terms of their life cycle, quite complex, but what I'm trying to do is illustrate how their life rotates, and it's this thing called an alternation generation. So there's a familiar star moss there with a seed capsule, the spore capsule. At the top of that spore capsule, you find the structure, and if you whip the cap off, you'll find this squarish structure with a little hat. Now they've got technical names, but when the spore capsule is fully developed, that's what it looks like without the little hat on. The spores will be released, which you see here, and then they fall to the ground. They get blown by the wind, they colonize a new land, and the spore then develops into a bud, produces an anchorage root-like organ, and then that grows into a baby plant, the plant that we recognize as the moss. It's called a gametophyte, and you get gametes. Like a gamete, you have eggs and sperm. Well, this phase is a sexual phase, and here you can see this structure, which is a male reproductive structure, and then the female one is less distinctive. So basically, water is required for the sperm when they're developed to swim to the egg, and the egg is fertilized, and it starts to grow, and then it grows into the capsule that we recognize. So we have this rotation between the spore part of the life cycle and then the spores released, and that water is essential for all of this, because the sperm need to swim, and and the mosses will desiccate without water. So living in humid environments, water is very, very important for their life cycle. This can be shared later on. I just thought we'd look at a few of the different mosses that we get that are really more common and abundant. Like this one, star moss, beautiful big cushions, 40 centimeters deep. They do have water conducting structure. So I said that they don't conduct water, but these ones are one of the unique ones that actually can transport water up from the base up to the leaves. So they do draw water up through specialized cells, but they form these beautiful hummocks. It's known, I've always known it as star moss. It's otherwise known as common hair-cap moss, and polytrichum means lots of hairs, and the capsule that you get at the top, very poor image there, I had to zoom in, but you get lots of hairs on the capsule, and that's an example in a wet upland area in the UK. So you can see they're very prominent spore structures there. But not all star mosses are the same. So there are other species that look like it that you'll come across because they have the same pattern. They're still polytrichum, but they're different species. So there's one called formosum, which is smaller, grows to about 20 centimeters, and it likes drier habitats and more shade. And then there's another one, kind of brownish leaf there, forms cushions up to 20 centimeters again, but it's found in peat areas. So you find it more exposed sites rather than shaded sites. And then you get a third type, Pilliferum, which has got long, white, pointy leaf tips, so probably more desiccation tolerant, drought tolerant. And then another one, which is called Juniperum. So you can see they're very similar, but these two at the bottom are much smaller. They're only 2 or 3 centimeters tall, whereas these go up to 20 centimeters. So size, habitat, location is key and fundamental to maybe differentiating between which type of haircat moss, style moss they are. Another group of mosses which I'm going to talk about here are the sphagnum mosses. They're so abundant, especially in our uplands, and there's 34 different species of them in the UK. They're amazingly multicoloured carpets that you get. You find them in bogs, marshland, heaths, moorland, anywhere that's damp and it contains water. So the sphagnums create this living layer on top of what is a wet and dead environment below it. So we'll just look at bogs as well, because sphagnum are essential in forming bogs, so they're really, really important. But they're very spongy, so you could pick up a moss, squeeze it, a sphagnum moss, and they can hold 20 times their own weight in water. So they're very absorbent, big sponges, very important in a kind of flood prevention kind of thing for holding water in the uplands. So maintaining habitats is really, really important. Some grow very slowly, some grow very quickly. So we get them that grow a few millimeters a year. Others tend to grow up to 3 centimeters a year. And when they die, they don't rot away, because the ground that they're on, that boggy environment, is both wet and acidic. So sometimes we hear about acid bogs. These are species, very, very difficult to identify the species accurately without hand lenses and looking at certain structures. So I've omitted to put the species on this, but these are individuals that I've seen and identified. So I'm not going to mention all the names, but Capillifolium is so confusing. But when we look at them, they have a very similar structure, and they're what we recognise as sphagnum mosses. So they love these waterlogged conditions where there's very little oxygen in the water, and they're also very acidic. And that combination doesn't allow bacteria to function, so it's anaerobic. So the organisms that are underneath in the water are not decomposing, but they're building up, and they're forming over hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, this soil which is rich in organic matter, plant matter, and it's known as peat. So in bogs, we get this peaty environment, and it's because it's acidic, and the sphagnum mosses themselves, they get their nutrition from rainwater, and they exchange as a chemistry exchange, and they make the environment around them more acidic. So they actually add to the acidity of a bog. If the substrate that it's on is very alkaline, or if the water that's running through a bog is very alkaline, we know them as fens. But if it's rainwater on a non-calcium rich environment, we get bogs. So a bog and a fen is to do with the acidity that you get within that environment. So you may have heard of fens, may have heard of bogs as well. And then the final one, subnitens, and that's just got its reproductive structure as well, just to illustrate that they all have these reproductive capabilities. So we get lots of bogs in the uplands. It's cold, the soil is acidic, and there's no oxygen, and that's perfect for forming the environment that's required to prevent desiccation, and the land has got to be kept cold and humid, so perfect for forming these big areas, what we know as blanket bogs, where we get this cold mountain or damp environment. A few examples of mountain mosses that you may have seen, you may recognise, or they may be new to you. Beautiful apple fountain moss that you find in wet areas, so coming off rocks in these damp marshy areas, but near rocks where there's overland water flushing down, what are called wet flushes, you find Philanotis fontana. I love that name, apple fountain moss, and you can see why it's called apple fountain moss. One which is really common in the mountains, moorlands, and rocky environments, very dry habitat, is the woolly hair moss, and again that woolly nature is to do with the leaf tips having these little hairs, which is meant to reflect sun's heat, so it's meant to be an adaptation to living in a dry environment. So that's one of the Racemicium, and that's quite significant in the uplands. Woolly hair moss. In damp, rocky cracks and fissures that you get where there's water that's pouring down, water's essential, you get all sorts that you'll see growing. There's a yoke moss there. And then really common again in moorlands, around the roots of crowberry there, and on bilberry and on heathers, you find this red stem feather moss growing up. And then you might also find these little rounded, on exposed rock surfaces. But again, if you look closer, you'll see the white hairs at the end of those mosses. Woodland environment, a beautiful, damp, humid environment, perfect for the growth of mosses. And again, I try to select ones which are fairly common, but they've also got common names, because it's very easy to hide behind the species names. But there's like we used to call this one an eyebrow moss, because it looks like big bushy eyebrows. Greater fork moss. Again, the habitat at base of trees. In woodland leaf litter, you'll find it in damp areas along riverbanks. Felted thyme moss, like translucent leaf, you can see that, just one cell thick. So all that leaf will absorb water, it will also lose water. So it's found in a very damp environment, very humid. Fern moss, it's got this regular branching, very, very common in woodlands. And then one on trees that you find, there's not so many species that live on trees because it's quite a dry environment. But tree moss there, and then narrow-fringed moss, just to give an idea. So Racemicium is the one that we saw, the woolly hair moss, but the same family, Racemicium there, but in a different environment. Similar, same family, but a different environment that they live in. Just to finish off, we're going to play one more Kahoot. So if you would like to join in with this, there we go. We'll get the code popping up in a second. So again, it's www.kahoot.it, and it's on 5 questions on mosses. Four 24 004. Just give it another minute. There we go. True or false? Liverworts were named by the doctrine of signatures because they resemble the liver. It is true. So in Latin, they're known hepatici, so like hepatic and your liver function. So yeah, well done there, Sarah. Percentage of a sphagnum bog by water, by weight is water. They can hold 20 times their own capacity as well, so it's a huge amount there. So yeah, it's 85%. Incredible sponges. Well done there, Mike, nipping into the lead. True or false? There are many uses of sphagnum because its absorbance in, so its antiseptic property. So yeah, it is true. A long time ago. Well done, Mike. Question about peat. How long does it take a metre of peat to form? Very slow process. And it's 1,000 years, so a millimetre per year accumulation, roughly. Saying there, well done, Mike. And the last question, true or false? The Icemummy Otzi, found in the Austrian glacier, was found with moss in his clothing. True or false? And he also had some spores in his belly, so there's evidence of where he'd come from the spores that they found. So yeah, it was an insulation. So Phil, well done. 5 out of 5. Well done, Mossy. And Mike, superb, well done. There we go. Well, we're coming to the end of the presentation. Just to let you know, this is, as I said at the beginning, there's a series of 6 webinars. Next week, Wilding the British Uplands I've got the privilege of having Steve Everson from Nearly Wild presenting that. It'll be a fascinating talk on the current state of wilding in the British Uplands and about reconnecting ecosystems, looking at that. Then we've got Paul Gannon returning to talk about the geology of the Peak District. Then we've got the glacial heritage in Britain. Paul will come back again to talk about the geology of the Alps. And then just into early December, I've got John Roberts, a senior archaeologist with Snowdonia National Park, talking about archaeology and things that we'll find in the mountains. So please feel free to sign up to any of those. I'll have workshops working again next year. But also, hot off the press, I had today a test pack of my latest product, which is a set of playing cards. I've got to check them and then get the packs sent. So a couple of weeks' time, hopefully, we'll have a new set of playing cards based on trees. So good for winter identification as well as summer ID. So that was a bit of a plug there. Just finally, with your, if you'd like to take part in just giving a little bit of feedback, a review, again, Mentimeter is one of these interactive apps. So type in www.menti.com and enter a code 7706910. And there's a couple of slides. If you could just give feedback there, we'll just get a quick review of how you felt this evening's webinar went. So the code is 7706910. Microscopic, yeah, it is. It's mind-boggling how tiny everything was, and when you try and look for those features and structures and things, it's much easier if you take a good photo and then look at it back on a computer. Fab photos, thank you. Lots of information, mind-boggling. I will make the presentation available after this, so I'll send out an email so you can review some of the things that I showed on that. I'm happy to share that with you. So. Thank you very much for your feedback there. How do you rate the webinar? And then I'll just have a quick check of any comments. If there's anything that pops up, I'll email everyone at the end. So yeah, that's fantastic. So thank you all very much for taking part, enjoying this autumn on this very wet, damp, perfect evening for lichen and moss outside. But perfect evening to be inside as well. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you again. Okay, bye-bye for now.